The air was sharp and frigid, the kind of biting cold that seemed to seep through the thick canvas of the MiG-25's protective covers. A low, slate-gray sky pressed down on the lonely airfield near the Pacific coast, the chill a constant, heavy presence. It was 8 a.m., and the ground crews, huddled in their heavy, oil-stained jackets, moved like automatons, their breath puffing out in brief, white clouds against the metallic skin of the MiG-25P interceptors. These jets, known in the West by the NATO reporting name Foxbat, were the Soviet Union's most closely guarded aerial secret, a $9 million titanium and steel answer to the USB-70 Valkyrie and an enduring symbol of Soviet technological prowess. Inside the briefing room, a place smelling faintly of old cigarette smoke and stale coffee, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko sat rigid, his movements economical, a mask of professional boredom fixed on his face. He was 29 years old, a decorated pilot from the 495th Fighter Aviation Regiment, a man whose entire life had been meticulously mapped out by the dictates of the Communist Party and the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO. Today's mission, he knew, was nothing out of the ordinary, a routine training flight, a scramble to test response times against an imaginary intruding force over the Sea of Japan. On paper, it was a drill. In Belenko's mind, it was the final countdown. He watched Major General Yevgeny Shelikov drone through the weather report and the assigned flight corridors. Belenko's thoughts were miles away from the droning voice, consumed instead by the small, carefully concealed items in his flight bag. A small vial of his wife's tranquilizers, which he carried to steady his own nerves, or perhaps for a more desperate final action, and the map, meticulously folded, with a single, crucial destination circled in red pencil. Hakodate Airport, Japan. The grievances that had brought him to this point were a heavy, internal ballast. It wasn't just the professional stagnation, the realization that his skill and ambition were stifled by the rigid, corrupt hierarchy of the PVO. It was the grinding, soul-crushing mediocrity of Soviet life, the endless queues for substandard food, the shoddy apartment blocks, the pervasive feeling of being trapped in a system that demanded everything and gave back crumbs. He had joined the military with youthful ideological zeal, but 4 years into his service, that zeal had been eroded to cynical despair. He looked across the table at his fellow pilots, good men, mostly, their faces already showing the weariness of a life lived under a constant, dull pressure. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a terrible certainty that if he didn't act now, he would be buried alive by the system. Back on the tarmac, the ground crew, led by the stern senior warrant officer Kirsanov, began the final pre-flight checks on Belenko's assigned jet, MiG-25P, Bort number 31. The twin Tamansky are -15B -300 turbojet engines, raw and immensely powerful, were checked for fuel and oil pressure. The jet's revolutionary, mostly TIG-welded steel airframe, designed to withstand the thermal and kinetic stresses of Mach 3 flight, stood gleaming under the weak morning sun. Kirsanov noted the pilot's odd, detached silence, but attributed it to the usual pre-flight intensity. Belenko was, after all, one of the best. Belenko climbed the ladder, settling into the cramped, utilitarian cockpit. The harness webbing was stiff, the smell of avionics and hydraulic fluid strong. He ran through the checklist with practiced, automatic precision, his hands moving over the switches and gauges. The heart of his plan lay in the RP-25 Smerch A radar and the sophisticated electronic countermeasures, ECCM, suite, the very equipment he was trained to use to protect the Soviet borders. He knew its strengths and, crucially, its weaknesses. At 9:15 a.m., the tower crackled to life, giving the clearance. Belenko thumbed the starter. The Tamansky engine shrieked, a deep, earth-shaking roar that announced the machine's immense power. He taxied out onto the runway, the ground shaking beneath the jet's weight. He paused at the holding point, his heart hammering an irregular, fierce beat against his ribs. He radioed the tower, his voice steady. 31 is cleared for takeoff. Good flight. The controller's monotone reply was the last official communication he would have with the Soviet Union. As he slammed the throttles forward, the $9 million secret accelerated with terrifying force. He retracted the gear, lifted the nose, and within seconds, the flat, bleak landscape of the Soviet Far East was shrinking beneath him. He was climbing not just to altitude, but to the point of no return. The first and most immediate danger was the MiG's design itself. The Foxbat was not built for defection. Its engines were fuel-hungry monsters, notorious for their limited range. He had to be fast, precise, and use every drop of high-octane aviation fuel to make it across the 650 miles of hostile water to his freedom. Belenko pushed the stick, sending the mighty MiG 25P Bort number 31 into a near-vertical ascent. This was the most critical phase, the period when his flight path would appear utterly normal. Soviet doctrine dictated that interceptors on a scramble exercise accelerate rapidly to high altitude, typically between 60,000 and 70,000 feet, 18 to 21 kilometers, where the Foxbat was most efficient and lethal. The high altitude would also extend his glide range later, a necessary evil given the jet's infamous fuel consumption. In a cramped cockpit, the pressure was immense, both physical and psychological. He watched the altimeter spin, 30,000 feet, 45,000 feet. The landscape below was a blur of featureless green and gray, receding rapidly into the atmospheric haze. At 65,000 feet, the aircraft leveled out, cruising at over Mach 2.5. At this speed and altitude, he was practically invulnerable to any conventional Soviet fighter scrambled after him, a fact he relied upon. The sheer performance of the Foxbat, built to intercept the fastest Western threats, was now his greatest protection from the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO, itself. However, speed and altitude also made him a clear, easily tracked signature on the Soviet radar network. This network, a dense, interlocking mesh of ground-controlled intercept, GCI, stations stretching along the perimeter of the Far East, was designed to spot any unauthorized penetration instantly. Belenko knew the dead zones, the blind spots, the brief moments of latency in the massive system. He had studied the maps, memorized the patrol routes, and practiced this evasion countless times in the privacy of his mind. He banked south-southeast, flying what appeared to be a standard outbound leg, a routine picket flight designed to test the readiness of coastal defenses. For 5 tense minutes, he maintained the expected course, feeling the scrutiny of the ground controllers miles away. Then, with a practiced, smooth movement, he executed the first critical maneuver, a slow, deliberate turn to the east, heading directly for the Sea of Japan and international airspace. The ground controller, a weary lieutenant named Borisov at the Khabarovsk GCI Center, saw the slight deviation. Bort 31, confirm heading. You are 5 degrees off designated corridor. Borisov's voice crackled through the headset, laced with standard, low-level irritation. Belenko's response was calculated and calm, delivered in the precise, clipped tone of a pilot dealing with a minor equipment issue. Roger, control. Experiencing minor compass drift. Compensating now. Back on track momentarily. He held the lie for another 90 seconds, then pushed the stick hard, initiating a shallow, high-speed dive. The intention was not merely to change direction, but to execute a maneuver known in the PVO as a nap-of-the-earth dive, dropping out of the upper surveillance layer. He pushed the nose down, and the MiG-25, designed for stability at high speed, responded sluggishly at first, then plunged. The G-forces pressed him hard into his seat as the altimeter needles began an agonizingly swift reverse sweep. 50,000 feet, 40,000, 30,000. He watched the fuel gauge with desperate intensity. This low-altitude, high-power descent was burning his precious remaining fuel at an alarming rate. But it was the only way. His heart pounded against his ribs, a drumbeat of pure adrenaline. At the GCI Center, the display suddenly showed the signature of Bort 31 vanishing from its expected high-altitude plot. Lieutenant Borisov frowned, adjusting his dials. The jet was simply too low, flying beneath the main lobe of the primary radar. This was an acceptable, if unscheduled, training maneuver. Bort 31, your altitude is below minimum specified for this phase of the exercise. Acknowledge and return to 18,000 meters. Belenko didn't answer. He was screaming across the wave tops, down at 200 feet above the water, the salt spray potentially kicking up toward his engine intakes. The sea was a violent, cold blue, a featureless expanse reflecting the gray sky. At this altitude, the MiG's engines were gulping fuel, but he had achieved the miracle. He had dropped below the Soviet air defense net. He was no longer a target. He was electronic noise, lost in the clutter and reflected signals bouncing off the choppy water. He flipped 2 covert switches on his console, killing the automatic transponder signals that identified him as a PVO asset. In the eyes of the Soviet command, Bort 31 was either lost to a catastrophic engine failure at sea or, worse, a deliberate defection. Belenko knew the truth. He was flying in the most dangerous, narrow window between these two outcomes. The crucial distance was covered. He was now over the Sea of Japan, heading into the international airspace that abutted the Japanese Defense Identification Zone, JDIZ. He still had roughly 450 miles to fly, and his fuel situation was already critical. The real challenge had just begun, evading the American and Japanese radar systems, who would now be seeing an unidentified, fast-moving threat screaming toward their territory. Belenko focused with a cold, desperate clarity on the fuel totalizer. It was dropping faster than he had anticipated. The low-altitude dash had been necessary to punch through the Soviet envelope, but the thick air resistance was punishing the Tamansky engines. He was now skimming the waves at a precarious 200 feet, his speed reduced to a mere 450 knots, around Mach 0.69. He had traded performance for invisibility. The Foxbat, the fastest interceptor in the world, was flying like a commercial airliner in distress. His training now became a weapon against his intended allies. He knew that the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, JSDF, and the U.S. Air Force, USAF, operating in the region relied heavily on high-altitude airborne early warning, AW, platforms, specifically the American EC-121 Warning Star and the new Japanese ground-based systems. These radars were designed to look down and spot high-flying threats. However, they were still susceptible to sea clutter, the electronic noise generated by radar waves reflecting off the surface of the churning water. Belenko made a slight adjustment to his heading, correcting for the wind drift. He was now directly approaching the Japanese Air Defense Identification Zone, JDIZ. He estimated he had less than 10 minutes before his silent, low-flying presence would be picked up by the most sensitive ground installations on Hokkaido. The pressure in the cockpit was suffocating, compounded by the rising heat from the engine bay. He glanced at the radio. He resisted the insane temptation to call for help. Any immediate radio transmission would give away his exact position and intentions, potentially leading to a deadly intercept by Japanese or American fighters who would assume he was a hostile bomber on a high-speed penetration run. His survival depended on his continued electronic silence until the very last moment. In the JSDF Northeastern Air Command, NEAC, center at Misawa Air Base, far to the south, the radar operator, Sergeant Kenji Ito, noted an anomaly. A fast-moving, persistent low-altitude contact was tracking toward Japan's northern coast. It was not a typical pattern. Routine traffic, fishing boats, domestic flights were all accounted for. The unidentified contact was moving too fast for maritime traffic and too low for a commercial aircraft. Ito's supervisor, Captain Harada, leaned over his shoulder, tapping the screen. "Is that sea clutter, Ito? Or an exercise?" "Unidentified, Captain," Ito replied, his voice taut. "No flight plan. No IFF transponder. Range closing rapidly. Estimated velocity is surprisingly low for a possible military incursion. But it is holding altitude precisely at 200 feet. The situation immediately escalated. A low-flying, non-communicative military aircraft approaching Japanese sovereign airspace from the Soviet Union was treated as the highest level of threat. Within seconds, the alarm was raised. On the nearby island of Hokkaido, at the Chitose Air Base, the JSDF 201st Tactical Fighter Squadron was put on immediate alert. Two F-4EJ Phantom II interceptors, armed and fueled, were preparing for a scramble. Belenko, however, was ahead of the curve. He had anticipated the scramble and knew the standard vectoring the Phantoms would take. He intentionally held his course, flying directly toward the coast of Hokkaido, as if he intended to penetrate deep into Japanese airspace. This forced the JSDF to commit their interceptors to a defensive vector, anticipating a high-speed chase. As he closed to within 50 miles of the coast, Belenko executed his second critical maneuver. He pulled back on the throttle, bringing the MiG-25 below its minimum operational speed, making the controls feel mushy and heavy. He then abruptly cranked the stick and rudder, executing a sharp, jarring turn to the south-southwest. This radically changed his trajectory, pulling him away from the immediate threat of the scrambled Phantoms and putting him on a new, direct line toward his ultimate target, the civilian Hakodate Airport. The effect on the Japanese radar was immediate and confusing. The contact, initially vectored for an intercept 100 miles north of its current position, suddenly appeared to vanish, only to reappear minutes later on a completely different bearing. Captain Harada swore quietly. He's jamming? No, it's a course change. He's heading south, not inland. Where's he going? Belenko, now flying over the rugged, green terrain of southern Hokkaido, knew exactly where he was going, but he was losing his race against physics. The fuel warning light was blazing an angry, insistent red on the console. The MiG-25 was an aluminum whale with wings, designed to carry maximum speed and weaponry, not loiter. He had to land now. The problem was that the Hakodate Airport was a small civilian facility, not equipped to handle a jet of the Foxbat's immense size and speed, and he had no landing charts, no approach vectors, and no way to visually assess the field. He was flying blind into a potential disaster, but it was the only option left. The cockpit air was thick with the scent of ozone and perspiration. Belenko's hands, gripping the stick, were slick despite the cold. He was now operating on the very last vestiges of his fuel reserves, the needles on the twin gauges hovering just above the empty mark, the warning lights screaming their mechanical protest. The engines were beginning to cough, minor surges and dips in power indicating the fuel pumps were sucking air. He had maybe 3 minutes of flight time left, maximum. He broke through the overcast layer over the southern tip of Hokkaido, and the small coastal city of Hakodate appeared beneath him, nestled by the sea. He spotted the airport immediately, a single short runway, dwarfed by the massive span of his MiG-25P. It looked like a child's toy landing strip. The runway was designated February 20th, and it was barely 6,500 feet long. For a fighter designed to land on massive military bases, this was dangerously inadequate. The MiG-25 required nearly 8,000 feet of clear pavement, even with full braking chute deployment and perfect conditions. Belenko began his improvised approach. He had to bleed off speed and altitude simultaneously, a procedure made exponentially more difficult by the jet's famously poor low-speed handling characteristics. The Foxbat was a brute designed for blistering speed in thin air, not delicate maneuvering close to the ground. Every movement of the control surfaces was a battle. He lowered the gear, feeling the shudder as the heavy landing struts locked into place. The drag was immense, but necessary. On the ground at Hakodate Civil Airport, utter chaos reigned. The air traffic control tower was manned by civilians and a few local security personnel. They had received frantic, garbled warnings from the military authorities about an unidentified, hostile object, possibly attempting an emergency landing. The controller, Mr. Kenji Tanaka, stared through his binoculars, utterly speechless. What he saw was not a private Cessna or a domestic airliner, but a menacing, gray-painted war machine, unlike anything he had ever seen, descending with alarming speed. Its massive, squared-off wings and twin vertical stabilizers screamed military power. Tanaka frantically yelled in a microphone, attempting to broadcast on the emergency frequency. "Unidentified aircraft, you are approaching a civilian field. Go around. Go around. Runway is not clear." Belenko heard the garbled Japanese warnings but ignored them. He was beyond communication. His focus was tunnel-visioned. The angle of descent, the rapidly approaching tarmac, the unforgiving forest looming beyond the runway end. He was too fast and too high, but he couldn't afford a second pass. The engines were sputtering now, the sound rough and uneven. He dropped the massive, distinctive leading-edge flaps. The MiG-25 shuddered violently in protest, but its descent rate increased. He executed a steep, diving turn, a high-risk maneuver that risked stalling the jet, lining himself up precariously with the center line of runway 20. He was coming in at over 200 knots, nearly 50 knots faster than the recommended landing speed for a jet of this type on a short field. In a desperate, final attempt to kill speed, Belenko deployed his air brakes. He was skimming the rooftops of the small airport buildings now, the roar of the dying engines shaking the windows of the terminal. The runway rushed up to meet him. Touchdown! The landing gear hit the tarmac with a violent thump-thump, hard enough to jar his teeth. He slammed the throttles to idle. There was no reverse thrust to worry about. Immediately, he actuated the emergency chute release. A massive, parachute-like drogue chute deployed from the tail, snapping taut with a tremendous crack and billowing out behind the Foxbat. The drag was instantaneous and brutal, pressing Belenko violently against his harnesses. But it wasn't enough. The Foxbat's momentum was overwhelming. The short runway was disappearing beneath the nose of the plane. He stood on the massive brake pedals, feeling the anti-skid system fighting the tire's desperate grip on the concrete. Smoke began to curl from the overheated brakes. With less than 500 feet of runway remaining, Belenko realized the truth. He would overshoot. He was rocketing off the end of the paved surface. The MiG-25, the jewel of Soviet aviation, tore through the final boundary fence, ripping through the chain link like tissue paper. It careened across an open field of dirt and weeds, scattering debris, before finally coming to a grinding, dramatic halt. Its nose angled precariously toward a local radio antenna. He had stopped just 750 feet short of a heavily trafficked local highway. The silence that followed the engine's final gasp was deafening, absolute. Belenko slumped forward in his seat, his body trembling, the exhaustion and relief hitting him like a physical blow. He was alive. He had landed the $9 million secret in the most humiliating spot possible, in a ditch next to a civilian airport. Belenko didn't move for nearly a minute. He allowed the violent, shaking adrenaline to recede, replacing it with a cold, professional calm. The mission wasn't over. He was on hostile soil, surrounded by civilians, and the entire power structure of the Soviet Union would, at this very moment, be realizing the scope of his betrayal. He had to secure the aircraft, or at least ensure its most sensitive systems were protected until he could formally surrender to the proper authorities. He unbuckled the heavy, multi-point harness, the metal clanging against the fiberglass composite of the ejection seat. He reached for the cockpit canopy release lever. With a dull hiss of hydraulics, the massive canopy slid back, exposing him to the cool September air and the incomprehensible sight of a quiet, Japanese suburban landscape. The first sound he registered was not the wail of sirens, but the frantic, high-pitched chattering of Japanese voices and the rhythmic click-click-click of cameras. A small crowd had already gathered. They were not military or police, but bewildered civilians, airport maintenance workers, a group of businessmen in dark suits who had been waiting for a flight, and an incredibly fast-moving cohort of local reporters who seemed to materialize out of thin air. They stood at the edge of the crushed wire fence, staring in stunned silence at the enormous, menacing gray hulk of the Soviet jet. The sight of the MiG-25P up close was overwhelming. It was gargantuan, the tail fins taller than a man, the twin engine nozzles gaping like the maws of some metallic beast, and the airframe itself scarred by the hasty, desperate landing. Stenciled clearly on the nose was the bright red board number, 31. This was no ordinary military jet. Its sheer power radiated, even in its broken, resting state. Belenko took off his helmet, revealing his close-cropped hair and the exhausted, pale face of Soviet officer. He felt their gaze, hundreds of eyes fixed on him, a moment of profound, surreal vulnerability. He raised his hands in a clear gesture of non-aggression, then began to climb down the cockpit ladder, his heavy flight boots crunching on the muddy turf. The security guard from the airport, a man named Katsuo Tozawa, was the first to approach. He carried a small, utterly inadequate wooden club and wore a simple blue uniform. He was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of the situation. He shouted something in rapid Japanese. Belenko, relying on the few phrases of English he knew and universal military gesture, shouted back in heavily accented English. "Pilot, Soviet, defection, contact us military. I need protection." He pointed emphatically at the jet's nose, then to himself. The message, despite the language barrier, was devastatingly clear. This wasn't a crash. It was an intentional act. It was a defection. A Soviet pilot had voluntarily landed his top-secret fighter in the heart of the Japanese nation. The reporters, sensing the magnitude of the story, surged forward. Camera shutters were opening and closing with manic energy. The first images of Viktor Belenko standing next to his enormous, crashed MiG-25, his flight suit stained with oil and dirt, were being captured. Within the hour, these photographs would be beamed around the world, creating an instant global crisis. Belenko, maintaining his composure, walked away from the jet and took out his standard-issue Makarov pistol. This action sent a fresh wave of panic through the small crowd, but he didn't point it at anyone. Instead, he raised it high above his head, then bent down and placed it carefully on the dirt next to the crushed fence. It was a visible sign of surrender and good faith. He then pointed back at the jet, specifically at the nose radome housing the powerful Smerch-A radar system. He urgently pantomimed a request for a covering or a guard, stressing the word secret with a gesture of zipping his mouth. It took the arrival of the local Hakodate police 15 minutes to establish a tenuous perimeter. The sight of uniformed police officers attempting to cordon off a Soviet Mach 3 interceptor with simple yellow caution tape was another layer of absurdity on the unfolding international drama. They treated Belenko with cautious, meticulous Japanese courtesy, formally taking him into custody. As Belenko was led away, he looked back at the MiG-25. The sight gave him a final, perverse satisfaction. He knew that even if the jet was recovered, the technology, the reason for the Foxbat's entire existence, was now irreversibly compromised. The Soviet military's most devastating secret was sitting in a Japanese field, exposed to the world, its capture being broadcast live to the very military intelligence services he had hoped to reach. The news hit the Kremlin like a tactical nuclear strike. It wasn't the loss of a single pilot that mattered. Defections were a painful, but manageable, reality of the Cold War. It was the loss of the MiG-25P Foxbat, the very symbol of Soviet air superiority, and the catastrophic intelligence failure that accompanied it. In Moscow, at the heavily guarded Ministry of Defense, it was late afternoon. Marshal Andrei Grechko, the Soviet Minister of Defense, was attending a routine political meeting when an aide, white-faced and visibly trembling, interrupted with a coded, urgent message. The content was brief but devastating. Bort 31 has landed in Hakodate, Japan. Pilot V. Belenko in custody. The immediate reaction was a whirlwind of denial, fury, and panic. The first official stance, hastily coordinated across the PVO and the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, Foreign Counterintelligence, was to classify the event as a forced landing due to a navigation error or, preferably, an in-flight emergency. They claimed that Senior Lieutenant Belenko was a loyal Soviet officer who, through a tragic mishap, had accidentally strayed into Japanese airspace. This narrative was vital to invoke international law regarding the return of the aircraft and the pilot. However, the rapid dissemination of photographic evidence by Japanese media instantly shattered this fragile lie. The image of Belenko standing next to the massive jet, his deliberate surrender of the pistol, and the clear testimony of his shouted declaration of defection made the forced landing story untenable. The international community, already captivated by the audacity of the act, openly scoffed at Moscow's spin. The humiliation was visceral. For years, the MiG-25 had been cloaked in an aura of invincibility, a masterpiece of Soviet engineering designed to terrify NATO. It was rumored to be constructed of exotic materials, powered by engines of impossible thrust, and armed with futuristic weapons. Now, the crowning achievement of the Soviet aerospace industry was sitting ignominiously in a Japanese drainage ditch, surrounded by children and reporters. A high-level emergency session was called, involving the Politburo, the KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, and key military commanders. The atmosphere was poisonous. Accusations flew. How could a pilot, trained in the elite PVO, execute such a complex, high-risk defection? The focus immediately shifted to internal purges and security cracks. This is not merely a loss of a plane. Marshal, Andropov's voice was dangerously quiet, his gaze fixed on Grechko. It is the loss of face. The Americans now have our eyes and ears. Every system, every frequency, every weld of that machine is now theirs to dissect. We must demand its immediate, unconditional return, and we must discredit the pilot. The KGB quickly launched a smear campaign against Belenko. He was instantly branded a traitor, a coward, and a mentally unstable opportunist who had abandoned his wife and child. Soviet state media published articles suggesting he was a man deep in debt, obsessed with Western materialism, and easily corrupted by foreign intelligence agencies, a desperate attempt to undermine the intelligence value of his defection. Meanwhile, a full-scale operational review was ordered within the PVO. Every single flight procedure, radio frequency, and security protocol was considered compromised. The military faced a massive, expensive overhaul. Change in doctrine. The high-altitude escape maneuver Belenko used, previously considered secure, had to be immediately restricted or altered. Equipment modification. The internal layout and systems of all existing MiG-25s were suddenly suspect. The KGB feared Belenko had tampered with secret documents or devices before his flight. Personnel purge. Hundreds of PVO pilots, ground crew, and commanders who had trained with Belenko or worked near Board 31 were subjected to intense investigation and political re-education. The most immediate operational concern, however, was the possibility of a retrieval. Diplomatic cables, laced with aggressive demands and veiled threats, began to flood the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Moscow demanded the immediate extradition of Belenko and the return of the undamaged aircraft, citing the lack of Japanese legal authority over a Soviet state asset. But the Japanese, backed by the implicit support of the United States, were playing a calculated game of obstruction. They understood the intelligence bonanza they held. Legally, they asserted their right to investigate a military aircraft that had made an unscheduled, unauthorized landing on their soil, citing potential violation of airspace and damage to civilian infrastructure. The truth, known to everyone, was that the Pentagon was already mobilizing. They were racing against time and Soviet demands to get their hands on the prize before it was returned, if it ever was. The clock was ticking, not just for the MiG-25, but for the fundamental balance of Cold War air superiority. The diplomatic standoff commenced immediately. A high-stakes, multi-layered game of Cold War chess had played out between the Soviet embassy in Tokyo, the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and the U.S. Embassy. The Soviet ambassador, Dmitry Polyansky, a veteran diplomat known for his hardline demeanor, was relentless. His demands were delivered daily, sometimes hourly. Immediate return of the pilot and the aircraft, both considered sovereign Soviet property. The tone of the cables escalating from professional protest to thinly veiled threats of economic and political retaliation. The Japanese, caught between their powerful Soviet neighbor and their indispensable American ally, performed a masterful act of diplomatic procrastination. The Prime Minister, Takeo Miki, and the Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to glean intelligence that would justify billions in future defense spending and solidify their relationship with the U.S. They adopted a strategy of procedural slowness and bureaucratic complexity. The official Japanese statement was a carefully crafted masterpiece of obfuscation. The aircraft was involved in a criminal investigation, specifically violations of aviation and immigration law and damage to airport property. Until the investigation was complete, the aircraft must remain in custody. Furthermore, the Soviet pilot, Viktor Belenko, had formally requested political asylum with the United States. While Japan had not granted the asylum itself, they recognized his right under international human rights protocols to be dealt with by the receiving power, the U.S., a process that required time. Within 24 hours of the landing, the first contingent of American intelligence officers and aerospace engineers arrived covertly in Japan. The CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and the U.S. Air Force's Foreign Technology Division, FTD, scrambled their best experts. Their objective was simple: get hands-on access to the MiG-25 before the diplomatic pressure cooker exploded. The MiG-25, still sitting nose down in the mud at Hakodate, was initially guarded by local police and the newly deployed Japan Ground Self-Defense Force, JGSDF, troops. The soldiers, armed with Type 64 rifles and anti-aircraft guns, established a perimeter, primarily to hold back the throngs of curious onlookers and journalists, but also to signal to Moscow that the jet was now under Japanese protection. The U.S. team, led by a colonel and a senior DI analyst, initially received only limited Japanese-supervised access to the Foxbat. They were permitted to visually inspect the exterior, take measurements, and photograph the exposed components. Even this limited access was an enormous intelligence coup. The analysis began instantly. Airframe composition. Initial inspection of the cuts and stress points in the airframe, caused by the harsh landing, revealed a massive surprise. The West had long feared the MiG-25 was built almost entirely of advanced, lightweight titanium alloys, contributing to its feared Mach 3 capabilities. The reality was astonishing. The bulk of the fuselage, approximately 80%, was constructed of heavy, arc-welded nickel-steel alloy. This immediately explained the aircraft's notoriously high fuel consumption and its relatively low G limit in combat. It was a flying fuel tank built around gigantic engines, not an agile dogfighter. Pilot debriefing. Simultaneously, Belenko was taken to a secure, undisclosed location where a joint CIDI team began the debriefing process. Belenko was motivated, cooperative, and articulate. He was an intelligence goldmine, bringing with him not only his first-hand knowledge of flying the aircraft, but also his pilot's checklist and manual, a document strictly forbidden to leave Soviet territory. This physical document was invaluable, revealing detailed performance limitations, maintenance schedules, and operational specifics. The real prize, however, was inside the jet, the RP-25 Smerch-A radar system. This powerful unit, long feared as a revolutionary advance, was the core of the Foxbat's intercept capability. To gain full access, the Japanese agreed to move the aircraft to a secure military installation. Under the guise of a domestic necessity, that the damaged jet could not simply be flown out, the MiG-25 was loaded onto a massive, flatbed trailer and transported under heavy military escort to Hyakuri Air Base, a joint U.S.-Japanese facility near Tokyo. This was the moment the Soviets had desperately tried to prevent. The clock had now officially stopped for Moscow and started for the Western intelligence community. The physical disassembly and detailed exploitation were about to begin. The hangar at Hyakuri Air Base became the most critical intelligence laboratory of the Cold War. Under the intense glare of halogen lights, the MiG-25P, Bort number 31, was meticulously prepared for an unprecedented examination by a joint team of American and Japanese analysts. The Americans, in particular, operated with a singular, feverish intensity, knowing that every day the plane remained in Japan ratcheted up the diplomatic tension with Moscow. They needed to extract every possible secret, and they needed to do it quickly and professionally. The first major component to be detached was the wings. American engineers from the Foreign Technology Division, FDD, wearing white anti-static suits and carrying high-resolution cameras, set about the task. They discovered that the Foxbat was not assembled with the sophisticated precision they expected. Much of the construction relied on manual spot welding rather than advanced automated machining, lending the internal structure a surprisingly crude, almost industrial aesthetic. The use of nickel steel, a simple, heavy material, further solidified the finding from Hakodate. The MiG-25 was an interceptor designed for sheer speed and altitude, not the agile, multi-role fighter the West had feared. The real prize, however, was in the nose. The RP-25 Smerche Tornado radar. This was the heart of the Foxbat's fire control system, a colossal unit feared for its rumored ability to incinerate enemy electronics. When the technicians opened the housing, the discovery was anticlimactic, yet revolutionary for intelligence gathering. The Smerche was not based on modern, lightweight, solid-state circuitry, as was standard in U.S. fighters like the F-15. Instead, it was filled with old-fashioned vacuum tubes. While this technology was obsolete in the West, the engineers immediately understood the Soviet rationale. Vacuum tubes were inherently more rugged, cheaper to produce, and crucially, they were impervious to the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, generated by a nuclear blast. The Soviets had prioritized operational survivability in a total war scenario over miniaturization and sophistication. Furthermore, the vacuum tubes allowed the radar to generate an enormous power output, estimated at 600 kilowatts, making it incredibly effective at burning through any potential enemy jamming. However, the examination also revealed a fatal flaw in the Smerche, one that exposed the fundamental difference in Soviet and American fighter design philosophy. The radar lacked any meaningful look-down/shoot-down capability. It was effectively blind to targets flying close to the ground because it could not filter out the ground clutter, the electronic noise reflected by the earth. This confirmed Belenko's operational briefing. The Foxbat was a purely defensive, high-altitude weapon designed to intercept high-flying strategic bombers, like the never-produced B-70 or the B-52, not to engage in low-altitude dogfights with modern Western fighters. Next came the Tamansky R-15B-300 engines. The sheer size of the engines was staggering, but closer inspection revealed their brutal inefficiency. The Foxbat was essentially two massive engines with a pilot strap between them. They were water-cooled and had a maximum operational life, measured in a few hundred hours, far less than their Western counterparts. The engine analysis confirmed Belenko's desperate fuel management during his flight. The R-15s were notoriously thirsty, severely limiting the jet's combat radius and endurance, reinforcing its role as a short-dash point defense interceptor. Analysts calculated that pushing the jet beyond Mach 2.83, as was occasionally rumored, would essentially destroy the engines, reducing them to scrap metal. Every piece of the aircraft was photographed, cataloged, and documented. From the wiring harnesses, which were thick and heavily shielded, to the basic materials, common stainless steel alloys, the Americans received the complete, unvarnished technical blueprint of their most feared aerial adversary. The final piece of the puzzle came from the onboard weapon systems and avionics. The R-40 air-to-air missiles carried by Bort 31 were bulky and heavy, designed for speed and range rather than agility. The navigation system, the Polyet-11, was complex but similarly rugged and unsophisticated by Western standards. Belenko's earlier debriefing was proven correct in every technical detail. The myth of the ultra-sophisticated, maneuverable Soviet superfighter was permanently dismantled. The MiG-25 was a specialist, an engineering compromise built to satisfy a very specific, high-altitude threat scenario that was already becoming outdated. The intelligence windfall was unparalleled, but the findings changed the way the West would view Soviet technology forever. Less emphasis on sophistication, more on brute, specialized function. The sheer volume and depth of the intelligence derived from the MiG-25's disassembly forced a radical and immediate reappraisal of Soviet air power by the American military and NATO command. For years, the Foxbat had been the existential boogeyman, the primary driver behind the requirement for a new generation of Western air superiority fighters like the F-15 Eagle. The belief was that the U.S. needed a fighter that could outclimb, outrun, and outfight this titanium marvel. The reality, as revealed in the hangar at Hayakuri, was dramatically different. The Soviet fighter was fast, yes, but only in a straight line at high altitude. Below 30,000 feet, it was an overweight, undermaneuverable truck with engines. The Foreign Technology Division, FTD, team compiled their preliminary findings in a top-secret report that circulated rapidly through the Pentagon and Langley. The key intelligence takeaways were vulnerability to dogfighting. The heavy steel construction and low G-limit, rated only for 4.5 GS with a full fuel load, meant the MiG-25 would be instantly defeated in a close-quarters dogfight against the highly agile F-4 Phantom II, let alone the emerging F-15. The F-15, developed specifically to counter the perceived Foxbat threat, was actually far more capable than necessary, a finding that validated its design but also demonstrated the danger of intelligence estimation based solely on rumors and high-altitude flight records. Radar limitations. The vacuum tube-powered Smerche radar, while immensely powerful and EMP-resistant, was virtually useless for engaging low-flying cruise missiles or attack aircraft due to its lack of look-down/shoot-down capability. This single technical weakness meant the Soviet PVO had a massive, exploitable blind spot in their defensive network. Engine fragility. The R-15B-300 engines had a shockingly short service life and were voracious fuel consumers. This dictated that the Foxbat was strictly a point defense interceptor with a minimal combat radius, incapable of sustaining long-range offensive patrols. These findings were immediately integrated into Western air combat doctrine. USAF and U.S. Navy pilots who had been trained to fear and avoid the MiG-25 were now trained to engage it differently, force it down to low altitude, and maneuver against it, where its design flaws would render it harmless. The entire operational threat assessment for the European and Pacific theaters was rewritten. The interrogation of Viktor Belenko continued to yield high-value, non-technical intelligence. He provided detailed descriptions of Soviet tactical air deployment, pilot training standards, which he described as rigid and focused on single-pass interception rather than dynamic combat, communications protocols, and the locations of various ground control intercept (GCI) stations. He also confirmed the widespread discontent among Soviet officers regarding the quality of life, a crucial piece of counterintelligence confirming the ideological vulnerabilities of the Soviet system. Belenko was, in essence, the key to decrypting not just a machine, but an entire military culture. While the technical analysis proceeded, the diplomatic farce reached its climax. Moscow, furious and humiliated by the month-long delay, sent escalating demands. They were fully aware of the exploitation happening in the Hayakuri hangar, even if they were publicly denying the scope of the defection. Finally, in late October 1976, nearly 2 months after the landing, the Japanese government announced the conclusion of its investigation. They formally agreed to return the aircraft. The MiG-25, once a fearsome, whole machine, was now disassembled into 30 meticulously labeled crates and loaded onto a Soviet freighter at the port of Itachi. Adding one final, calculated insult to the injury, the Japanese government presented the Soviet Union with a bill for the entire operation, totaling approximately $40,000. This included the cost for the damage to the Hakodate airport, the crushed fence and antenna, transportation to Hayakuri, and the precise, custom-made wooden crates used for shipment. The bill was never paid by the Soviets, who considered it an outrageous act of provocation. The return of the crates did little to soothe Moscow. The act was a hollow victory. The Soviets received a broken, disassembled jet, while the West had gained its blueprints, operational limitations, and, perhaps most importantly, the pilot. The geopolitical scales had tilted dramatically. The humiliation in Japan galvanized a frantic, massive-scale response within the Soviet military-industrial complex. The defection was not simply a loss of intelligence. It exposed the core vulnerabilities of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO, to the entire world. The detailed, meticulous dismantling of the MiG-25P, Bort number 31, meant that everything from the wiring schematics to the radio frequencies and radar limitations were now an open book to NATO. The Soviet Ministry of Defense and the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, OKB, immediately initiated the most expensive and urgent modernization program in the PVO's history. The goal was to render the intelligence gained by the West useless as quickly as possible. This massive project resulted in the rapid development of the upgraded model, the MiG-25PD, with the D standing for Dorobodny, refined/modified. The most immediate and costly measure was the complete replacement of the compromised systems. The heart of the change was the abandonment of the archaic, vulnerable RP-25 Smerche radar. It was replaced with the much more advanced Sapphire-25 Sapphire radar, which utilized newer, solid-state electronics. Crucially, the Sapphire-25 incorporated the long-missing look-down/shoot-down capability that Western analysts had identified as the Foxbat's fatal weakness. This upgrade allowed the MiG-25PD to effectively track and engage low-flying cruise missiles and fighter bombers, suddenly closing the massive defensive gap Belenko's defection had exposed. Furthermore, the R-15B-300 engines were replaced with the new, slightly more efficient and reliable R-15BD-300 power plants. While still fuel-thirsty, these new engines addressed some of the maintenance and reliability issues Belenko had cited in his debriefings. The entire electronic countermeasures, ECM, suite, the identification friend or foe, IFF, transponder codes, and all radio frequencies were immediately purged and replaced across the entire Foxbat fleet and other PVO aircraft. Thousands of pieces of sensitive electronic equipment were literally ripped out and destroyed, a profound financial and logistical shock to the Soviet economy. The Soviet reaction extended beyond technology. The PVO instituted sweeping disciplinary and ideological purges. Commanders at Sokolovka and the entire Far East region faced demotion, transfer, or dismissal. Pilot training protocols were heavily revised to emphasize compartmentation of knowledge and heightened scrutiny of personnel. Belenko's former comrades were put under intense surveillance and political re-education. The KGB intensified its foreign counterintelligence efforts, seeking to identify and neutralize other potential defectors who might hold key technological secrets. The return of the crates was a bizarre spectacle that the Soviet state media used for propaganda. The Soviets publicly claimed that the crates contained only fragments, and that the Japanese and Americans had deliberately destroyed the valuable aircraft out of spite and an inability to understand the superior Soviet technology. They demanded $10 million in damages from Japan, asserting that the aircraft had been damaged beyond repair by the dismantling process, a demand that was never met. This public posturing was designed to save face and project an image of technological invulnerability, even as their engineers were working around the clock to correct the exposed flaws. In a powerful act of military signaling, a reconnaissance variant of the MiG-25 was flown at high speed and altitude over the Sea of Japan shortly after the crates were returned, a clear message to the JSDF and the U.S. that the Foxbat program was alive, well, and unbowed. The psychological element of the Cold War required that the Soviet Union immediately reassert the threat. However, the cost of the Belenko defection was incalculable. It validated the fundamental design direction of Western fighters like the F-35 F-15 and F-16, giving the U.S. a renewed confidence in its technological superiority in key areas like avionics and low-altitude radar. The modifications rushed into the MiG-25PD meant a complete break in the production line, wasting years of development and billions of rubles. Belenko's flight had done more than steal a jet. He had forced the Soviet Union to spend a fortune playing catch-up to counterintelligence they themselves had handed over. While the disassembled remains of his MiG-25 were being shipped back to the Soviet Union in crates, Viktor Belenko was flown on a secretive, high-security American air transport from Japan to the United States. He was granted immediate political asylum under the direct order of President Gerald Ford, recognizing the extraordinary value of his contribution to Western intelligence. The defection was a moral and strategic victory for the West, and Belenko was instantly transformed from a disillusioned Soviet pilot into a prize intelligence asset. Belenko was taken to an undisclosed facility, likely a secure location within the Washington, D.C. area, where he began an exhaustive, months-long debriefing process conducted primarily by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, DI. This was far more than an interrogation. It was a deep dive into the operational culture, mindset, and weaknesses of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO. He spent weeks meticulously detailing everything he knew. The technical insights he provided were invaluable, confirming the operational limitations of the R-15 engines, the procedures for arming and firing the R-40 missiles, and the specific limitations of the Smerche radar. He was able to fill in the blanks where the physical examination of the aircraft had left ambiguities. For instance, he explained the rigorous but often impractical flight protocols, the constant fear of engine failure due to poor quality control, and the exact radio frequencies and scramble codes used for daily PVO operations. His human intelligence, was equally vital. Belenko offered a unique, candid perspective on the reality of life inside the Soviet military apparatus. He spoke of the endemic corruption among high-ranking officers, the poor morale of the enlisted men, and the scarcity of basic consumer goods which fueled widespread dissatisfaction. His insights helped Western psychological warfare experts and policymakers craft more effective messaging and propaganda aimed at eroding the loyalty of other Soviet personnel. He confirmed to his debriefers that his motivation was not financial, but a desperate search for personal freedom and an escape from a stagnant, oppressive system. The intelligence agencies utilized Belenko's knowledge in multiple ways. Refining threat models. His data was incorporated into American flight simulators, allowing U.S. pilots to train effectively against the true, rather than rumored, capabilities of the Foxbat. Validating U.S. programs. His confirmation of the MiG-25's lack of look-down/shoot-down radar capabilities provided strong justification for the continuing development of sophisticated American radar systems designed to exploit this Soviet weakness. Countering Soviet propaganda. Belenko's personal testimony was used to counter Soviet media narratives, which painted him as a mentally unstable traitor. He later collaborated with author John Barron on the best-selling book, MiG Pilot, The Final Escape of Lieutenant Belenko, which offer human face to the defection and serve as a potent piece of anti-Soviet messaging. After the official debriefings concluded, Belenko was granted a new life and a new identity in the United States. He was given a trust fund and was employed by the U.S. government as a consultant, using his unparalleled experience to brief military and political figures on Soviet aerospace technology and military doctrine. He eventually became a naturalized American citizen through an act of Congress. His life, however, was lived under the shadow of Soviet reprisal. He knew the KGB considered him a high-value target for assassination. His movements were monitored for decades, and he lived with the understanding that his defection was an act of profound betrayal that the Soviet Union, and later Russia, would never forgive. His sacrifice, though, had paid a magnificent dividend for the Western alliance. The era of the terrifying, unknown Foxbat was over, replaced by hard, actionable intelligence, thanks entirely to the daring of one disillusioned pilot. His single-engine flight had shifted the balance of air power perception for the remainder of the Cold War. The defection of Viktor Belenko and the subsequent dissection of the MiG-25 Foxbat created a permanent, seismic shift in the Cold War dynamic that reverberated long after the crates were returned to Vostochny Port. The incident fundamentally changed two key aspects of the geopolitical standoff: the technological balance of power and the perception of Soviet capability. For the United States, the intelligence gained was the ultimate justification for the FX program, which birthed the F-15 Eagle. While the F-15 was already designed to be superior, the Belenko defection allowed U.S. engineers to confirm its advantages and stop spending vast sums of money on countermeasures for a threat that was fundamentally misunderstood. The knowledge that the Foxbat was a heavy, speed specialist interceptor with poor maneuverability and radar limitations allowed American air doctrine to be fully optimized for agility and sophisticated look-down radar, reinforcing the qualitative edge of Western fighters. The technical findings did not just influence the F-15. The detailed understanding of the Soviets' use of durable, non-miniaturized electronics, vacuum tubes, for EMP protection informed the development of more hardened American avionics systems. The West learned that Soviet engineering priorities were often more robust and geared toward survivability in a nuclear conflict rather than the pure technical sophistication of systems valued by the West. This nuanced understanding prevented overreaction to future Soviet technological announcements. The legacy for the Soviet Union was one of deep, lasting shame and immense expense. The MiG-25PD upgrades, rushed into service to replace the compromised systems, were only a stopgap measure. The need to retrofit and re-engineer a flagship fighter so quickly exposed the political and strategic cost of maintaining such extreme secrecy. The KGB and the PVO spent years hunting down the systemic security flaws that allowed Belenko to slip away. More significantly, the psychological damage done to the Soviet military's self-image and the international perception of its air power was profound. Moscow had relied on the myth of the Foxbat. Belenko traded the myth for reality. The defection also had a long-term impact on Japan's defense posture. The incident highlighted the undeniable gaps in the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, JSDF, radar and interception capabilities, as they were unable to effectively track or intercept Belenko's low-flying jet. This directly spurred the JSDF to push for the acquisition of the American Grumman E-2C Hawkeye Airborne Early Warning AW aircraft and later, the more advanced F-15J fighters, which possessed the superior look-down radar capabilities required to prevent a similar intrusion. Belenko's single flight catalyzed a fundamental, necessary upgrade of Japan's air defenses, further integrating them into the Western security architecture. Viktor Belenko himself became an indelible symbol of the Cold War, the individual who chose freedom over ideology, revealing the vulnerability hidden behind the facade of Soviet power. His story served as powerful anti-communist propaganda for decades, used to illustrate the moral bankruptcy of the Soviet system and the allure of the West. Despite the ever-present threat of assassination and the enduring separation from his family, he successfully transitioned into an American life, his historical importance assured. In the end, the dramatic flight of the MiG-25, Bort No. 31, was a microcosm of the Cold War itself. A fierce, high-speed, high-stakes confrontation driven by technology and espionage, but ultimately decided by the human element. The Soviet guards at Sokolovka were indeed shocked when their pilot stole his jet, but the shockwave he generated exposed the truth of Soviet aviation, humiliated a superpower, and provided the West with an unprecedented intelligence coup that remained a key strategic advantage until the collapse of the USSR. The rusting, disassembled crates returned to the Soviet Union were a physical monument to a failed doctrine of secrecy.